of the small business community at this point. And we obviously would love to support obviously them going forward. So as I mentioned, I'm Karen Casey. I am a certified public accountant as well as a CFP. You know, way back when I worked for a big 8 accounting firm, but retired from over 30 some odd years in banking in various positions. I also volunteered and sat on the boards of various nonprofits at the end of the day. And I have a co-presenter, Jo Mohr. Jo, if you want to unmute yourself and obviously introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jo Mohr. Like Karen, I'm a CPA and started out in public accounting, branched into commercial banking, and at the end of my career was doing technology licensing and M&A. Have a strong interest in nonprofits and have served on boards, and I'm happy to be with you here today.
Thank you, Jo. And let's go to, this is what we're going to talk about, getting started in obviously looking at your board management process, bylaws, which are very important to obviously setting obviously the stepping stones for what you need to do as a nonprofit and for your board, setting expectations, social media, as well as board recruitment and best practices. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jo to get us started.
Thank you, Karen. I'm punching the wrong buttons here for some reason.
That's okay.
Okay, now I think I have it. Okay, so you've decided you want to start a nonprofit. How do you begin? Well, right after you pick the name for your nonprofit and select your initial members of the board, the next step you need to take is to complete the state and IRS reporting and registration requirements. And exactly what do those include? Well, among other things, you need to complete your articles of incorporation. Those are the documents that officially establish the legal organization that is your nonprofit. You have to do an initial report to the state of South Carolina, and you will need to file for both IRS and South Carolina tax ID numbers. After you've done that, the next step is to hold your initial meeting and to elect the officers of your nonprofit. In South Carolina, you're required to have at least 3 officer positions, the position of president, secretary, or treasury. And the next step, which is really an important one, is you want to apply for a 501c federal tax exemption. And anybody who's not familiar with what 501c means, it's simply a reference to the IRS code that provides for the fact that charitable organizations are not required to pay federal income taxes. So that's important. South Carolina will have a similar exemption, and you'll need to apply for that as well. If you are planning to fundraise, and I assume all nonprofits are for the most part, you'll be required on an annual basis to register to conduct fundraising activities. And you'll be required also to have a business license. Now, the state of South Carolina doesn't require a business license, but various counties and cities do. This sounds like a really long list of requirements. One of the things I did just to see what I would turn up is I Googled this, and I found a number of websites that list out these various steps that you need to take, explain what they are, just sort of on a cursory level, and then provide you links to places where you can either accomplish it or learn more. So I strongly recommend that if you're just getting started and trying to figure out what all of these requirements are, you take a little bit of time to just Google them and see what's out there. There's lots of information that will be very helpful. So the next thing you need to do is create your mission and vision statements. And there's a lot of confusion about what those two are and how they are different. Your vision deals with whatever the overall goal is for your organization, and your mission provides more detail on just how you will accomplish that. So the third step is to craft and pass your bylaws. And we're going to talk more about bylaws in a moment. They're a very important part of the process of getting your nonprofit set up. You'll want to craft some job descriptions, particularly for your executive director, but any other paid positions within the organization. We have here select executive director. Your initial executive director might be you if you're founding it, or it could be a third party. It happens both ways. And finally, you'll want to create a strategic plan for how you're going to accomplish your mission and vision. So, Karen, can you advance the slide? So let's talk about bylaws. And there's some, it's important to understand what goes into them, but it's also important to note that there can be some pitfalls in how you draft these documents. First of all, your bylaws are the governance document for the board. It just simply outlines how you're going to operate. You'll have the what's required for approval and what the responsibilities are for your board member or for others within the nonprofit. It's a general document. It's expected to provide direction to the organization, and it's generally not a document that you would update frequently, certainly not annually. What you would have in a separate document, which is generally called a standard operating manual, that's where you would have the more specific around operation of the organization, and that document might be updated more frequently as situations change. We'll provide you, when we send out a copy of this presentation, some example of bylaw sections, but I would also, again, strongly recommend that you simply Google bylaws, and you'll find a lot of bylaws, particularly for nonprofits, and you'll find a lot of information available out on the website. Karen, next slide. So so here are some examples just quickly of what would go in there. Your official name, what the address of the nonprofit is, what your purpose is. You'll specify the number of directors. In the state of South Carolina, you're required to have a minimum of 3 directors. It's probably advisable to have more directors. Generally, people are going to have an odd number of directors because if you have a vote, you have a way to break a tie. The larger national organizations will typically have very large boards, and smaller organizations may have fewer. But in general, minimum 3, probably 5 to, I don't know, maybe 7 or 9 would be a more representative number. The bylaws will deal with the qualifications and term limits. So in South Carolina, you're required to have a minimum term limit of 1 year, a max of 5. 5 seems a bit long. Well, I've more typically seen something like a 3-year term, or 1 to 3 years. There's nothing that should say that you couldn't necessarily allow a director to have that term renewed, but at least the minimum initial term would be somewhere in that range. And there should be a process for adding and removing board members. You may have a member that resigns, but you could also end up in a circumstance, hopefully not, but you could end up in a circumstance where there is some issue with a board member and they may need to be removed from the board, and you need a process clearly delineated for how to do that. The bylaws should talk about how frequently the board of directors are going to meet, what kind of notice they're going to give, and what the quorum requirements are. If you're not familiar with what the term quorum means, it simply means the minimum number of directors that have to be present at a meeting in order for business to be conducted. And you would want this number to be sufficiently large that you could not have a small group of the board making very important decisions on behalf of the organization. So, for example, I live in a community that has a homeowners association, and we have a 7-member board, and our quorum is 5 members, just to give you a feedback. So less than 5 members at the meeting, you can't make a decision. You'd have to adjourn the meeting and reconvene at a later date when you could get a quorum. So also in the bylaws will be a list and description of board committees. So what kind of committees might you have? Well, it'll depend on the nature of your organization and to some extent how large an organization you are. But here are some examples of the kinds of board committees a nonprofit might have. You might have an audit committee because in general, it's best practice to have audited financials for a nonprofit. In some states, it's actually required, not in South Carolina. You might have a finance committee. You might have a fundraising committee or a communication committee, investment committee. You raise funds. They don't get dispersed all at the same time, so they have to be invested in some manner. If the funds are sufficiently of sufficient size, you may need a separate committee administering that. And you might have a nominating committee that would help identify board candidates to fill upcoming board positions. Your
Just so to interject there for a minute, well, 2 things. One is just be aware that when you are looking for directors, they cannot all be family members. I believe it's South Carolina requires you to have less than 3 who are family members on your board. So the people fall into that trap a little bit when they start a nonprofit from the beginning, is obviously they ask all their relations to be part of it. So one thing not to do. But then the other point, going back to your board committees, also don't fall into the trap, and I've had clients with this challenge, is that they think everybody who obviously is in charge of a committee has to be a board member. That's not true. So Joe just mentioned like a fundraising committee. You may have someone who's very good at fundraising, but they don't have to be part of the board. So you want to make sure your board is laser focused on that mission and vision that we talked about a little bit earlier, but do not hesitate to use volunteers to help you with the various committee needs and requirements. And again, I would just ask anyone with questions, please put them out there, because that's what we're here for.
Karen, that was a really good point. Among other things, we need to be mindful of the fact that your board members are volunteers. And in many cases, they either have other jobs or other responsibilities, and you don't want to wear them out. So having them too involved in a committee process where you have volunteers or others that could take on that role is not a good use of your board's time. You may or may not be familiar with the term fiscal year-end date. That simply means when you're what the definition of what your year is for financial reporting purposes. So in other words, when you produce annual statements, are they for the period beginning January 1st and ending December 31st, which is probably the most typical fiscal year-end day, or are they for some other period of time? So it could be, for example, from March 1st to February 28th or 29th. You can define your fiscal year end any way you want, but that would be done in your bylaws. We talked about the fact that bylaws are not intended to be amended frequently, but you may have a need to amend them. And if you do, there needs to be provisions within your bylaws for what the process is for doing that. And then finally, if you do dissolve your nonprofit at some point, the bylaws need to tell you how you go about that process. So next slide, Karen.
Joe, before we move on, we have a question is, can my board be my husband and my two brothers?
I
Uh,
think you answered that question.
yeah, I think the answer is no. I mean, you can have up to three, but it would not be in your best interest um, to obviously have just family members there. And we're going to talk a little bit as we get further into the presentation as to what you should be looking for board members at that. The other thing I just want to, and then there's another question, is there a better fiscal year end date, January to December versus other? I don't know of any. Generally, calendar year end makes it easier. I don't know, Joe. What's your thoughts?
Most nonprofits I've been familiar with have a fiscal year end. You know, corporations may have different reasons for doing that. It could be related to maybe they just don't want to have the same one because of
Mhm.
uh, uh, they have a certain seasonality, their business or whatever. But I think in the case of nonprofits, the most general one I've seen is a 12/31 year end, fiscal year end.
Yeah, the only other one I've seen is any nonprofit that's obviously very heavily reliant on government funding, whether it be at the county level, state level, or federal level. The federal government's year end is September 30th. Many of the counties are June 30th. So if you're heavily reliant on that funding from those sources for obviously your purpose, you may want to consider that year end just because you'll marry to the funding sources. Otherwise, you're going to have, obviously carryovers from last year for what they may have given you from this year. And it gets a little messy. You can do it. It just gets a little messy. So also be very much aware of where your funding sources are at the end. But obviously also if you're relying on government, I'll give you an example. SCORE is a nonprofit. SCORE has a September 30th year end. Why? Because the SBA is one of our primary funders of what we do at the end of the day, and that's a government entity. So just something to keep in mind. And again, please keep the questions going at this point.
Okay, do you have any others now, Karen?
We're okay right now. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so moving on. The bylaws should be, in some respects, more general. And we give a couple of examples of why that's the case. You would like to have within the bylaws enough specificity for people to understand what you're attempting to accomplish, but enough flexibility to allow you to respond to whatever circumstances may arise in the future. So, in the first example here, the mission statement says you'll service Hilton Head Island, but maybe you want to be broader in the bylaws because let's give an example. I think Bluffton, for example, is growing much faster than Hilton Head. And it may be that given the mission of your organization, in order to accomplish that or have the ability to respond to the environment appropriately, you would like to also be providing services in Bluffton. If your bylaws stated the board can decide the service area within Beaufort County, you'd be prevented to do that. Otherwise, you'd have to go back and have a bylaw amendment to be able to expand to Bluffton. And it was particularly a great example of this is everybody went through the COVID scenario where you couldn't do any in-person services. If your bylaws had only contemplated that services could be done in person, you would have had to have amended the bylaws perhaps to be able to even operate during the COVID pandemic. So as you look at the 3 points on the right side, the last one is particularly relevant to this idea of making sure your bylaws are general enough. The words shall and may are very important. Shall means you have to, and may means just what it says. You may or may not. So if you have that may word used in critical points in your bylaws, it could give you the flexibility you need to address the service requirements. So let's talk about conflict of interest for a moment. the bylaws need to address conflict of interest. This is going to be a particular concern to the IRS when they're looking at granting you tax exempt status. The question that someone posed about having all the board members be family members creates the appearance of a conflict of interest. So is this nonprofit being set up to benefit your family in some way, or is it being set up actually to benefit the beneficiaries that are part of your stated purpose? Conflict of interest, very important. And of course, you always, when you prepare these, want to make sure you abide by state requirements, and you want to make sure you've researched that adequately. So,
and there is one question. It says someone thought that the IRS set fiscal dates. No, it's your choice as to setting fiscal dates. You can choose whatever you want. You tell the IRS when you file for your 501c3 what date you are looking to do. So no, they do not set it at this point. They are set from a personal income tax standpoint. Is that all individuals have a 12/31 year end. Businesses have a choice, nonprofits have a choice. So just so you know. And that's the only other question.
Okay, good. So maybe we're set to move on. So let's talk about setting expectations for the board. And the first thing we want to be clear about with the board is what their fiduciary responsibilities are. And for anyone for whom the term fiduciary responsibility is not familiar, it's really simple. What it means is the board should be doing the right thing, in quotes. And why is that we need to express that? It's because it's important for protecting the organization's assets from misuse. It prevents conflicts of interest that we talked about a moment ago. It prevents, it just creates a higher level of professionalism and ensures transparency and accountability. So how do directors carry out or convey this fiduciary responsibility? Well, first of all, the fiduciary responsibility is typically put into three buckets. The first is the duty of care, which simply means that in order to make sure you're doing the right thing, you need to be informed and actively participate in the nonprofit. You need to attend meetings. You need to be aware of the programs that are going on. You need to make sure that the executive director is competent to be managing the organization. You need to look at the financials. You need to just be familiar with the operations and informed in every respect. Duty of loyalty talks about putting the organizational best interest ahead of your own. And the duty of obedience is just dealing with making sure that the nonprofit actions are within the purview of state laws and the purpose that was set out for the organization. So we'll talk about it a little bit more on the next page. Can you go to the next slide, Karen?
Sure. And just one story I want to obviously share is if you're, what happened during COVID, obviously threw a lot of nonprofits into a loop. But what we also found out, there are 1,600, and I think the number is even bigger, of 1,600 nonprofits in Beaufort and Jasper County alone. People were setting up nonprofits so that they could have a job. And that was kind of sad at the end of the day, because obviously either they were unemployed or obviously had challenges, they needed money, and they found an easy way to obviously make themselves an executive director and use obviously grant money to do that. So this goes back to the duty of care, loyalty, as well as supporting your mission. So do keep that, obviously file that away and we'll talk a little bit more about how you look for and we talked about this a little bit when you're starting a nonprofit series, the first workshop we did, is that, before you set up a nonprofit, look around and see if there's others doing the exact same thing, and maybe you should work together rather than doing something on your own. So that has been an issue in the past. The other thing is that what we saw during COVID is we saw mission drift. And this is really a role of the board. And we used to talk about that a lot more in this presentation. But during COVID, if your job was a food bank to give out food, but people were coming to you because they couldn't pay your utilities, but that's not your mission. In one case, I know a board member actually paid someone's utilities. So that became an issue because obviously that wasn't their mission. As much as you can sympathize with that poor person, obviously the struggles they had, you really have to go back to the bylaws and what your mission and vision are. So that's how important some of these things are at the end of the day. And we have no other questions right now, Joe.
Okay, so let's talk about fundraising. You want your board member on board to help you with oversee the operations of the nonprofit. But are you expecting that board member to either volunteer their time or perhaps donate money for the organization? I've actually seen some postings for board positions where they explicitly say out, we're looking for a board member not only to sign up to be involved in a nonprofit, but also to contribute X amount of money. Do you expect a board member to fundraise? Because when you are recruiting, this is an important consideration. Not everyone has the either connections to help you fundraise or the personality and desire to go out and fundraise. So is that an important part? Does every board member need to do that? Do some board members need to do that? If the board isn't going to be expected to fundraise, then who is going to be expected? Because that's a critical part of ensuring the success of the nonprofit. You got to have the money to accomplish your mission. Whatever your expectations are for the board in regards to fundraising, they need to be set up front. So the board will be focused on doing that, and so you'll not be disappointed in what the board delivers to the organization. Next slide, Karen. So one of the other, some other board responsibilities to approve and review the capital expenditures, major contracts, major transactions, approve budgets, plans, financials, oversee internal control and make sure there is adequate control. Balance constituents' interests. We talked about constituents' interests being different. Who are constituents? Constituents can be directors, it can be volunteers, employees, beneficiaries. All of those different interest groups may have slightly different interests, and some of those may be consistent or may not be totally consistent with your mission. You need to ensure compliance with applicable laws, and you need to establish the viability and sustainability of the boards and its committees. One of the things I'd say about establishing viability is I think to the extent that you have an organized and informed board that is involved, you're contributing to the viability and sustainability of the board, and the same is true of the committee.
And just to add to that point, one of the challenges, we do a lot of mentoring for nonprofits when it's in SCORE. We're probably one of there are, each chapter can mentor whoever their community needs. And because of the size of the nonprofits we have in this area, we do a lot of mentoring. One of the challenges I find with many of my clients is their lack of a succession plan for the leadership. So going back to viability and sustainability of the board and its committees, you really need to take a look at like whoever is the president, secretary, treasurer, whatever the roles are, fundraisers, volunteers you have. Well, what if that person no longer wants to do that job? What if that person moves on? What if that person has, obviously health issues? You need to look at that. And it's getting to some points for some of the nonprofits that I work with is that unfortunately, some of the things they have to do, they have to stop because no one's leading the parade. So if you have that passion for your mission, you really need to take a look at this at the end.
Karen, that's a really good point, and it would support the fact that maybe you even want to have a committee of people that are sort of charged with looking at that on an ongoing basis. Okay, I'm going to turn it. Oh, no, I have one more slide. So let's talk about when we talk about setting expectations for the board. One of the key tools in doing that is to develop a board policy manual that organizes in one place all the relevant information that that director will need for being fully participative in accordance with whatever the expectations are for the organization. So what you do in that board policy manual is you would, ideally it would be a binder, you'd have tabs on it, and you would include the important information such as mission and bylaws, whatever the written responsibilities and conduct are for the board members. You'd want them to know when the board meetings are scheduled for the upcoming year. You'd want them to know what committees exist, who the committee chairs are. You'd want information about financial management, who's in charge of doing the finances, any other policies. You'd want a code of conduct and conflict of interest policies. And by the way, best practice would say not only do you have the policies, but you get each board member to sign acknowledging they've read and intend to comply with the policies. There's something about putting the signature on that page that makes someone pay more attention and be committed to whatever the requirements are. You need whistleblower, HR, and internal control policies, all outlined in that. What you want is if a director has a question, they have the ability to go to your policy manual and either find the answer or find the name of the person they could go to get the answer.
And that's a good point because, there are two documents we're talking about here. Bylaws are your very broad brush what you do as a nonprofit. I'm going to obviously, provide food to the homeless in Beaufort County, let's just say. Your policy is much more specific. And that's why it's important to look at the specific policies as far as, that are listed here. But how do you do them? The bylaws are meant to sustain themselves for years. So you basically abide by your bylaws. Policies may change every year because things change at the end. So, but it is important that there are actually two different documents. We have two questions, Joe. Is there a limit on the number of board members? I want 10. Is that too many?
Karen, I want you to opine about this too, but no, I don't think 10's too many. First of all, it gives you 10 different hands that if you need help with things, you've got the ability to do that. You get 10 different perspectives. Karen's going to talk in a moment about recruiting board members, but it gives you the opportunity to have some diversity on the board. It's important to have different people. Different people have differing opinions. It gives you the ability to factor in all of those points of view. I think 10 is not too big a number. What do you think, Karen? What I do have a problem with 10 is it's an even number. That's where you might.
That was to be my point, Joe. I don't like even numbers on the board. When you have 10, you could have 5 saying yes, 5 saying no, and then what do you do? And again, it goes back to how you mentioned what's a quorum. Some people say, if you had, a quorum, if it's 10, it might be 6. To have a board and then to make decisions on certain things. Many people build into the bylaws that 51% of the people have to agree to do this thing, whatever this thing is, whether that's to do a loan or open a bank account or whatever else. So to me, an odd number is much more preferable. The only issue I have with the 10 is what are the roles of those 10 people? I love having differing opinions because it's great, but are all 10 going to be productive board members, or are you going to get into an issue with potential quarreling? at the end of the day, who says what about who, and that means that your president or chair of your board has to be very strong with people to say, hey, let's get back on track. You could get off on tangents after a while. So that's something you have to keep in mind. And we'll talk a little bit about, board recruiting and which is actually the next question, is how does the best ways to recruit board members? That's one of the sections that's actually coming out. And that's another question as well, as how do you find board members? And again, we'll talk about that in a minute right now. So
the suggestion would be maybe 9 or 11 could be better.
yes.
And then Karen will talk about some other
Mhm.
things to consider in addition to just the
Mhm.
actual number of board members.
Okay, and then one person says you want 5 women and 5 men and can have president as 11 for diversity. You know what? I don't have a real issue as far as male, female. I'm more interested in what are they bringing to the board as to skills, talents, and what their role is fulfilling. If you feel comfortable with 5 male and 5 female, that's great. I would be more interested on who's bringing what to the table that's going to support your board.
Well, and depending on what your mission statement is, a male female may not be the most important criteria for determining the diversity.
Mm-hmm.
I think being that specific is not necessarily appropriate. I agree with you, Karen, that talking in terms of skill sets that you bring is probably a more important measure. Although keeping in mind, to the extent that the diversity and ethnicity or gender could also play a role, that all needs to be factored in together.
Yeah, you have to think about both geographic and demographics of who you're serving, so that the people on your board should understand who you're serving. So going back to, is if you are serving people at a food pantry, let's just say, and most of your clients are out in, the town of Beaufort. I'm not talking about the county of Beaufort, or out in St. Helena, or if you're going into Jasper County and you have, out in Hardyville, it really goes back to maybe you need people who live there who understand the concerns and things that are going on at the point. So you really need to take a step back. And again, we'll talk about that in a minute as to who you're really wanting to do. So one of the other questions is, what are some of the board titles that you can have outside of treasurer and secretary? And can one board hold multiple titles?
You can have a member holding multiple titles. I'm thinking back, we have a vice president. We in several of the organizations that I've been involved in. Can you think, Karen, of other titles that you've
Well, you could
encountered?
have one board member that's just in charge of volunteer management, as an
Yeah.
example. Again, it goes back to, you could have, the fundraising person. You could have, it depends on what you're doing. If you have a retail space, let's say you do have a food pantry, you could have a person in charge of that food pantry. You can have, a person in charge of education. So if you have 2 different, like if you provide a product, but then also provide a service, let's say you educate people in technology. How do you turn on a computer and use Word and do a resume and the like? Maybe you have someone in charge of your education program. So again, it goes back to what is your mission and vision and what you need to do.
So those are actually more generally considered committee responsibilities. In terms of title, legal titles, the only ones I can recall seeing are president, vice president, treasury, and secretary. And the vice president role would have been designated in connection with the ability to execute contracts or other legal documents.
Mm-hmm.
But Karen's absolutely right. Having each of those directors responsible for kind of overseeing a functional area is sort of different and distinct from the officer titles.
And you're right. Legally, you only need the 3. But, your vice president, or I have seen nonprofits use the title president-elect, because again, going back to trying to get your succession planning there,
Right.
person, okay, that this president has signed up for a year, 2 years, whatever it might be. The president-elect might be in a position that they're learning from the president so that they could take over in 2 years' time, as an example. Those are not required titles, but there's something you may want to consider. We do have another question regarding diverse and skill set, and I will answer that in our next presentation at this point. So
Perfect. I'm turning it over to you, Karen.
sounds good. Okay, so let's talk a little bit social media. We try to put into these presentations something that's a little different each year, and this seems to be the hot button now for obviously many of our nonprofits. Social media now is obviously an essential part of what you do for marketing, and we actually have a marketing session coming up for nonprofits. But if it's not managed properly, there are very serious implications at the end of the day. So you really need to consider to create a policy that obviously ensures your postings are respectful and consistently on brand. And it does have to have a system of checks and balances as the guidelines, who can log in, who can respond. We all know, we look on social media and you see these people who go off on these tangents at the end of the day. And, well, do you respond to them and how do you respond to them? That's really a discussion you need to have as a board, that you don't want misinformation out there regarding your nonprofit, but you don't want to be answering all of these probably missives that might come out at the end of the day. So what should you be doing? What can go wrong? What employees, volunteers, and stakeholders may say may damage your reputation. Seriously, when you go out and look for funding, and most of you will probably be writing some type of grants, most of the foundations that give out grants, one of the first things they will do is Google you. So if they go out and Google you and someone says, oh, well, the president's doing a lavish lifestyle, or, they're there just because they want to collect the money or whatever, it could be totally damaging to your ability to get grants. So someone should be watching it. So you should really have a written social media and confidentiality policy. I had another incident in which a particular organization, that the board started letting information go out from board meetings. And it was in total violation of the confidentiality policy, but, which got the whole board upset as well as membership, because, it's not what they're supposed to do. So they obviously created their own problem. So you should be looking at what to do and what not to do. And again, protecting your organization's reputation and mission. You need to provide a clear idea as who is not acting, provide the clear they are not acting in an official capacity. So if you are saying something as a volunteer and you happen to volunteer with whatever nonprofit, and you put something out there negatively on social media, they're not putting that out there as part of that particular nonprofit. And they have to obviously are responsible to express their personal opinions, but you need to have a policy on how you answer that. And obviously you always have to be constructive. You do not entertain people who are, obviously, just gearing for a fight effectively. And we've seen it all at the end of the day. And I just saw a couple of questions pop up. They have an experience that they have 2 treasurers to oversee funds. What are your thoughts? Again, I normally don't see 2 treasurers unless you have a specific role for each. So the real question that comes at the end of it is, you may have a treasurer and someone to check on them, and that is more of an audit function. So I'm not 100% sure 2 treasurers are required, because you really need one person to make that decision. And do you have a board confidentiality template that you can share? I will get one out there and obviously send that with everything else. Are these policies needed to be included in the bylaws? You can mention in your bylaws that you have a policy, but the actual policy is part of your operating manual. At the end of the day, they do not need to be put into the bylaws at the end. So let's move on. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about board recruitment and best practices, because I know most of you have talked about that. So what are you looking for in a board? So you need to step back and say, okay, if my mission is to obviously establish a food pantry, what do I need the board to do? Do they need to have community outreach, or the ability to reach out to your community so that you can maybe get donations? Do they need to have fundraising capability? Do they need how to organize a store effectively so when people come in? What skills do you need from your board? If you have a current board, where's your gaps? I find it very interesting when I look at boards for some of my clients and they turn around and they say, well, half these people don't show up. And honestly, it's one of the things you should do in the bylaws, is that if you are saying you have monthly meetings or whatever they are, and that basically if someone misses 2 meetings, they're out. And be serious about it, because some people just join boards to say, oh, I am a board member. But honestly, and we've all seen it, these people do not participate in your mission and vision. And that goes back to, will they work hard to govern your organization? Will they support your mission and vision? Are they there just to have a seat at the table? The other question is, can you trust their decision making? So this is where it goes back to, and we'll talk about it in a minute, is that, what you need to do when you start interviewing for board members. And will this person help you drive the organization and complete what you are looking to do? Sometimes that's very hard to judge. So what should you do? Prepare a board recruitment package. You should have, when you're talking to someone who you think may or may not, and this could be a position that you have for a volunteer, this could be a board position that says, hey, listen, I want you to be part of, whether it's part of a nominating committee or a recruiter that says, I want you to be on the lookout for someone who you think can help us. So what is your organization's mission and vision? If you have a strategic plan or a very brief overview, it seems to be, I've done about 5 strategic plans already for my nonprofits, because they're all sort of rethinking what they want to do. You should have your annual report or an outside audit report if you have one, and your current operating budget. So again, when you're looking for a new board member, are you talking about a $50,000 budget or a $250,000 budget? Or maybe you're talking about a $10,000 budget because you've just got started. Go back and think about what your board position needs as far as time, commitment, expectations, and recruit accordingly. And then have your list of your existing board members and staff at the end of the day. So people want to know, well, who's on your board already? You should have not only on this in your board recruitment package, you should have this on your website. Who's part of your board and their background? Because obviously their background is going to attract other people of similar backgrounds. Have a formal application process. All you have to do is do a Google on applications for nonprofit board members. You're going to have a whole bunch that pop up. Pick out one. We're also going to send you, as part of this package, a board member agreement that you should be giving as part of the recruitment package, because it basically says, I'm going to abide by the rules, code of ethics, all of the other things we talked about that are part of your nonprofit. What do you do next? Create a prospect list. So, maybe you are missing a treasurer position. Maybe you have no one there that's a financial person. Well, that should be on your list. Maybe you have no one that knows how to do fundraising. Maybe that should be on your list. Maybe you need to expand your volunteer management so that you can support what you're doing. Maybe that should be on your list. Your board member, you should start conversations and meet in person. And funny, Joe and I, before this meeting, were just talking about how Zoom has changed our life. And while it's great, meeting in person, it's a lot harder for someone to say no to you in person than they do on a phone or on Zoom. So meeting in person with a copy of the package tells them that you are serious about what you do. Be very frank. Why are you interested in the current, and what are your current challenges, and what strengths are present? Interesting, if you did a strategic plan, you would have that all in front of you at the end of the day. Because one of the things in any strategic plan is what we call a SWOT: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Be honest with your potential board member, because they're going to be walking into the middle of it. If you're having a challenge getting money, if you're having challenges with your local government offices, be frank with them. Give them a tour. Have them have a formal interview with other board members. Be a guest at a board, obviously, and then follow up with thank yous every single time.
Karen, I have two quick questions for you.
Sure.
The first one is should there be mandatory background checks?
That is your decision. And it does not have to be, but I will say, if you're dealing with children, if you're dealing with obviously certain people who've gone through sexual abuse, I would say there should be. It goes back to, what is your mission? Because at the end of the day, you need to know that the people you're bringing in are not going to obviously cause you issues.
The second question, Karen, is if you have a community group, do you have to take minutes for the monthly community meeting as well as for your board meeting?
Well, what does your bylaw say? That's driven by your bylaws. So no, you don't have to. It is only your board meetings that you have to. It might be beneficial to even have a summary of what was discussed at your community group meeting, just for future references. But it's not a requirement. Let's put it that way at the end of it. Okay, let's move on. Once you've figured out your board member, once you've gone through the list, you met face to face, you've had another board member meet with that person and say, is this person a good fit? And again, think about what you need, not just what's a nice warm body. What is it that you have to have? Is it someone who does, take good notes, or, as I mentioned, financials? But then onboarding that new member is almost as important as recruiting them. Give them an organization overview. Now you can share all your documents, your operating a budget, your policy manual, your bylaws, your fundraising plan, your strategic plan in detail. What I find extremely useful is assign a mentor. Find another board member who's going to take a brand new board member by their hand and walk them through the process. Some people are very quiet when they're new board members because they're observing, and that's great. Others are more vocal in what their opinions are. So you have to be careful when the new person comes in to make sure they're in tune with the group, and they either don't take over the meeting or vice versa, don't participate in the meeting. And that's where another board member assigned as a mentor comes in handy, and do a 90-day formal review of that for the member feedback, just to give them, say, hey, maybe this wasn't handled quite right and you should do that. And I know that's always an uncomfortable position to be in, but it is something you have to think about.
Karen, I have two questions. One participant said, I have no board, with two exclamation points after it. So what can you say to this person?
Well, I don't know how you got your 501c3, because basically the IRS requires a board. So and as far as an article of corporation and the like. So you need a board, and you need it fast.
So second question, same person, is there something in writing that shows the roles and duties of each of the officers of the corporation?
Honestly, that is up to you. Every nonprofit has different roles and responsibilities, and you can see that's even coming up on the next slide I've got here. You need to understand what you need, because every nonprofit might be slightly different. You might have an educational bent. You might want to educate children for after school care, and obviously, for IT skills. You may want to have a food pantry. You may want to deal with people who are transitioning out of prisons and into real life. based on every one of those are different roles and responsibilities you need for your board. And honestly, what I'm going to say for the people with some of these questions, I honestly say you need a SCORE mentor, because that mentor should be able to walk you through this and do what you need specifically. So going back to the slide that's here, your board composition is intentional, not accidental. It's not like, hey, I have a great idea and why don't you just join my board? No, you've got a role. If you truly believe in your mission and vision, and you truly believe that you're going to fundraise and bring this idea to fruition, you need the people to support it. It needs to be intentional. It needs to have very clear communication and delineation of duties. You need to be engaged and committed. And you need to have an agenda and materials that you need. And you need to focus on decision making, not just status updates. I attended a board meeting at one point, and oh my God, we sat there for 2 hours and got nothing done, because everyone had to have their 20 minutes in the light to talk about it. They had 15 people on the board, and I'm sitting there and like, how do you get anything done? And again, we've already talked about term limits and succession planning. Questions to ask before joining a board. So this, now I'm going on the other side. So if someone has asked you to be on a board, are you interested in their cause, and how much time can you devote? Are you willing and able to assist with fundraising? Going back to what Joe said, many board members have a requirement. I had conversations with a couple of my boards and saying, well, you know what? If you're having an issue funding at least some of the basic stuff that you need to do, website and, just, flyers and social media accounts, because, they all cost money, perhaps you should ask every board member to fundraise $1,000. It doesn't mean they write a check for 1,000. Maybe they go to 10 friends and say, hey, give me $100. And that gets them their $1,000, but as a board member, are you willing to do that? Do you understand the roles and responsibilities? I certainly would never take a role as a board member without knowing what is expected of me. Are you willing to work as a team with people outside of your circle? It is uncomfortable to be a board member, because you are put in a position of leadership that you need to direct people. And can you make a difference? And do you feel overall comfortable with the health of the organization? If someone, and I mentioned what happened during COVID, if you're working in and someone's asking to be part of the board, but you're seeing they're in disarray, they don't have financials, strategically, they don't know where they're going. Well, you need to think about it. One of the other questions, which I did not put on this, is, do they have directors and officers liability insurance? Something you have to keep in mind, you are liable. Now, in South Carolina, there is a law that says that basically if you're a volunteer and you make a decision and it goes bad, you have some protection. I certainly wouldn't rely on that. Directors and officers liability insurance is a key piece of protecting your board, that if something goes terribly wrong, you could get sued as the board member. And do you really want that liability? Or is the health of the organization going to cause you issues with that? I see we got a couple of questions here. I filed for my 501c and applied for a Z version, which doesn't require board member information or bylaws. Once I get this information, should I reapply? You don't have to reapply. It's just that what happens is that EZ version is basically up to $50,000 of revenue. So obviously, they won't ask you the information, but it is assumed you have board information and bylaws when you file as a nonprofit, because they're also assuming that eventually you don't have to reapply. You already got your 501c3. It's just that when you hit a certain level that you'll be on the EZ version, you're going to be expected to give a lot more information. Are you available to help with creating a strategic plan and to set limits and expectations? What I would say is right now, I'm not sure I'm taking any more clients because I've got so many at this point, but there are plenty of SCORE mentors who know nonprofits. So I would ask you to reach out to obviously SCORE, and we'll talk about how you do that at the end of the day. And then as a board member, if a board member donates financially, are they allowed to file a tax deduction like a business or any party? Absolutely. Any type of donation to a legitimate 501c3 is tax deductible in accordance with the law at the end of it. So time and commitment. Serving on a nonprofit board is rewarding, but there is a commitment to time and skills. So obviously keep that in mind, both for when you're asking for a board member, as well as when you are obviously being asked to be a board member. So just keep that in mind. You will be getting certain of the resources. Here is the South Carolina Charitable Organization. Again, this will be part of the registration that we give, or the information that we give you at the end of this. So here's a couple of website that I find invaluable when I'm looking for things is boardsource.com. It is amazing how much information they have out there regarding nonprofits. Also, SCORE constantly has live and recorded webinars. Here's just one, but again, go to our website and you will find others. We will also send you a sample board member agreement and a sample of our bylaws. And is there any other questions at this point before we sign off? I know we're after the hour right now, so. So we got one more.
One more.
Okay, I live in Columbia, reached out to SCORE about nonprofit and I was told that there were none in my area. Am I able to get a mentor outside of my city? I would ask whoever contacted you at SCORE, I would ask them to refer it to another chapter that's close by and see if they can obviously address that. So yes, you can get a mentor if they don't do nonprofits, because yes, it's very specific, obviously, chapter to chapter. Okay, I'm going to do a quick wrap up. As I said, this is the third of a series that we're doing for nonprofits. We have them every Tuesday at this time. Next one, social media, then grant writing, fundraising, and banking products for nonprofits. Just want to emphasize this by Coastal States Bank. They will be talking about, because many of my clients are talking about capital campaigns and what would a bank finance? Well, this is the one on November 7th that you're going to hear exactly what they're going to, what a bank would typically finance from a fundraising campaign for a capital event. So I would think that's going to be very useful, because we've been chatting with them about supporting those efforts. We have one more series. We do a veteran series, but they're not just for veterans. They're for everybody. Personal credit and small business lending. So obviously done by Bank of America, who's another one of our great sponsors. So that's coming up on the 14th. We have had a QuickBooks series, and the last one is coming up on reporting and report customizations. Again, they're on Thursdays at noon. We also have the last of a social media series. The next one could be very interesting because it's building a strategic approach to a social media content. Again, some people don't even know where to start. The Ezra Agency and Ultimis, who's giving this, is great, and it will answer all your questions. And we have one more left on your intellectual property, as far as designs, provisions, and utilities, which also include your name. So things to think about, that if you have a very unique name for your nonprofit, should you copyright it? And I know a number of my nonprofits have done that at the end of the day. And Doug is wonderful online, and is a huge supporter of obviously. So how to find a mentor. So if you're looking for services, you can go to our website, which is at the bottom, and you will see find a mentor, put in your request, and obviously tell them specifically you're looking with someone with nonprofit experience, and to obviously please reach out to them. The other thing is we're always looking for volunteers, just like myself and Joe. We're always looking for someone who can help. We're particularly looking for Spanish-speaking business mentors. So if you are interested, and please follow us on our social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube. We are always posting information regarding our clients and information that we find useful to you. I want to once again thank Coastal States Bank for being the workshop sponsor. And they have been great about supporting this effort. And as I mentioned already, is that we are obviously a resource partner of the SBA, and they support obviously what we do. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for staying with us a few minutes after the hour, and have a good day.